Margaret. I am Margaret McCormick, Executive Director of the Benaroya Research Institute and the Chair of the Board of Life Science Washington. And it is my great honor to welcome you to the Washington State Life Science Summit 2021. I predict that the event the organizers have planned for us will live up to the summit tagline, celebrating success and sustaining our growth. First off, I'd like to thank all of the sponsors of today's summit. Your support for Life Science Washington events is important, and we never take it for granted. I have also been asked to convey some technical guidance for this morning's session. Please use the speaker view by clicking on the view option on the upper right-hand corner of the screen. You can use the chat feature to post your questions for the panelists. If there are other technical questions, please message LSW's Craig Matthews directly, also using the chat feature. Today is the last time LSW's CEO and President, Dr. Leslie Alexander, will have a chance to appear in front of our full life science sector, as she has announced her retirement at the end of the year. Personally, it is bittersweet, as over the last 5.5 years, Leslie has become a trusted colleague and a good friend. And while I am happy for her, I will miss her. But as a mark of a great leader, she leaves our organization in a better place than where it started. And I am truly grateful for what she has accomplished during her tenure. Under her leadership, Life Science Washington made our life science cluster visible to business leaders, elected officials, and the public, ensured our industry has a seat at the table on all relevant state and regional initiatives, strengthened relationships with Washington's Institutes of Higher Education, established and built up the critical Life Science Washington Institute to be a much needed and valued resource for entrepreneurs across the state, launched and coordinated a large number of workforce initiatives, including the very successful Find Your Best Life in Washington talent recruitment campaign, and initiated new efforts promoting and supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion activities across our sector. I could take much more than my allocated time to continue to recite Leslie's many accomplishments, but I think it is fair to say that what she is most proud of, and should be, is the incredible team she has built who work with her every day to support and strengthen our sector. As we all know, the last 20 months or so have been challenging to say the least, but our LSW team continues to work together, albeit virtually, to do the association's work. So please join me in thanking them. Obviously, there are many hardships associated with the pandemic, but one of the toughest ones is the inability to meet in person to honor life's transitions. Leslie's first day of work was the Life Science Innovation Northwest VIP reception at the Seattle Center back in May 2016, back when everybody was still a stranger. Now that she is an integral member of our community, I hope that you can find time to spend with Leslie to wish her well and celebrate her success while thanking her for sustaining our growth all these years. It is now my pleasure to introduce Life Science Washington's President and CEO, Dr. Leslie Alexander.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. It has been my honor to lead Life Science Washington for the past 5 years. Your unwavering support and partnership since I began has been invaluable to me, and I treasure our friendship. I want to add my thanks to all of today's sponsors for your generous support and give a special shout out to NanoString for consistently being our top supporter for this event. I also want to thank all our speakers for making the time to share their expertise and perspectives and crystal balls with us this morning. Special thanks to Kelly Lisbakken from Wedbush Capital for organizing and leading today's panel on life science investing. I especially want to thank my talented staff at Life Science Washington for once again orchestrating an outstanding virtual summit. Every day, I am thankful to have such a committed and energetic team supporting me. I would be lost without you. Today is bittersweet for me too, Margaret. I cannot believe this is my last chance to address our community as the leader of Life Science Washington, and that makes me a little sad. At the same time, our industry is vibrant and thriving, and what could be sweeter than that? There's far more I'd like to share today than my time will permit. So here is the essence of my message. Ours is a very different ecosystem than when I arrived 5 years ago. We have much to celebrate and be proud of. However, sustaining and even better accelerating our growth will require us all to lean in with a much greater degree of engagement than was historically required. When I arrived in 2016, our members were feeling undervalued, unsupported, and on their own in tackling issues most important to their growth. In fact, our companies had become almost invisible to anyone outside the industry. At that time, there were literally no reporters in Washington assigned to cover our industry, even on a part-time basis. Life Science Washington's #1 priority quickly became to turn that around. We did so by encouraging local editors to assign reporters to cover members' incredible work and by hiring a PR firm to generate messages resonating with our key audiences. We created a video to reintroduce our industry to business leaders and elected officials. And we produced a life science economic impact report with impressive data about our region that reached upwards of 59 million readers nationwide. Today, we are fortunate to have dedicated local reporters covering our industry routinely. Launched 18 months ago, our nationwide talent recruitment campaign, Find Your Best Life in Washington, continues to generate enormous visibility for our region, particularly with job seekers from the Bay Area, Boston, and other leading clusters. And our weekly e-blast, filled with member news, reaches more than 7,000 readers. With an overarching goal of building ecosystem vibrancy, our 2017 strategic plan also focused on meeting the workforce needs of our fast-growing industry and supporting life science entrepreneurs. Since then, we have successfully advocated for large state investments in life science infrastructure at Washington Institutes of Higher Education, including new facilities, teaching slots, and expanded programming. We also created the Life Science Washington Institute to give focused attention to entrepreneurs and startup companies. The results have been impressive. Today, Washington State is home to one of the country's top 10 life science clusters. Our new economic impact report released today shows our industry continues to grow faster than all other private sector employment in Washington and faster than other life science employment nationwide. It is noteworthy that commercial and manufacturing jobs are contributing to much of our growth, a trend that will undoubtedly continue as manufacturing facilities continue to be built and expand in our state. Jobs at over 1,100 life science organizations are now located in 136 cities throughout Washington, from Bellingham to Vancouver and Seattle to Spokane. New clusters are forming throughout the state based on local resources and capabilities. During our recent East-West Life Science Summit, founders of young startups shared that Spokane has a terrific value proposition for emerging life science companies. We could not agree more. Life Science Washington Institute also just published our latest life science investment report. During the past 12 months, more than $5 billion has been invested in Washington-based life science companies, with $4.5 billion of that raised year to date by 86 companies. According to CBRE, venture capital funding for Seattle's life science industry grew 266% in Q1 of 2021 compared with 2020, making ours the fastest growing major market in the country. So what does all this mean for our community? Above all, we need to wrap our heads around the fact that we're a totally different ecosystem than just a few years ago, and we're here to stay. That doesn't mean we're not without challenges. However, the challenges we face as a larger, more mature cluster are different than the ones we faced getting here. And it's important to realize that meeting today's challenges will require much greater engagement by you, our member companies. They're manageable if we engage collectively to address them. Clearly, workforce is at the top of the list. Every leading life science cluster is competing for the same talent. While we can't recruit our way out of the shortages, we can lean into attracting diverse talent and building cultures of equity and belonging for populations far too long overlooked for coveted jobs in our industry. This is a high priority topic for Life Science Washington as we assess how best to implement the excellent recommendations of our DEI work group. We also must develop our own workforce, something Life Science Washington cannot do without the full engagement of our member companies. You are the experts on the education, skills, and training required for your jobs, something you will hear from our workforce panelists. And I would like to leave you with now is that the states that are successfully addressing their life science workforce development needs are those where the companies in need of more workers are driving the initiatives with support from their industry associations, not the other way around. I can tell you from firsthand experience that this is exactly how North Carolina became the leading state in the nation for producing and sustaining a biomanufacturing workforce. I am confident Washington can do the same, and I will be cheering you on. Thank you. I am now delighted to turn the mic over to Chad Robbins, CEO of Adaptive Biotechnologies and member of the Life Science Washington Executive Committee of our board, to introduce our fireside chat.
Good morning. Thank you, Leslie, for all your accomplishments at Life Science Washington. It's truly been a pleasure serving on your executive board, and I think it's fair to say, and we can all recognize, that Life Science Washington is in a great spot now because of you. You will be missed. And now I have the honor and privilege of introducing this morning's fireside chat with Joel Marcus. Joel is a company builder, an asset class innovator, an astute investor, a philanthropist, a father, a fellow board member, an unbelievable connector of people, and a friend, not to mention Adaptive's landlord and Adaptive investor. Joel is the executive chairman and founder of Alexandria Real Estate Equities, the real estate investment trust that pioneered life science real estate from a specialty niche to a mainstream asset class, and today is the preeminent and longest tenured owner, operator, and developer that is uniquely focused on a collaborative life science, ag tech, and technology campuses and AAA innovation clusters in Seattle, as well as Boston, San Francisco, and all the AAA spaces. Since co-founding the company in 1994 as a garage startup with $19 million in Series A capital and a mission to advance human health, he has grown Alexandria into an S&P 500 company, which has a total market capitalization of over $30 billion and a total shareholder return of over 2,000%. These numbers are absolutely staggering. Joel also serves on the board of directors of several public and private companies, received his BA and JD from the University of California, Los Angeles. So one of the things that I have personally found most intriguing about Joel and valuable about the Alexandria ecosystem is his recognition of connecting people, top scientists, CEOs, investors, heads of R&D from biotech and pharma companies, in very highly curated, disease-specific and policy-oriented Alexandria summits, which I think are the best in class of the industry. I'm thrilled to welcome you, Joel, to the virtual stage with Leslie Alexander.
So Joel, welcome to our 2021 Washington State Life Science Summit. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. It's been so many years since we had the chance to visit about the industry trends and developments, and I'm really thrilled we can do so today. I know our viewers are eager to hear from you, but before diving in, I really want to thank you, Joel, not just for making the time to be with us today, but honestly for the incredible support we receive on a daily basis from John Cox, Alice Lee, and the entire ARE family. I really could not ask for better partners in our shared endeavor to build and strengthen our local life science industry. And Life Science Washington is thrilled to be located in the stunning 188 East Blaine building.
A great place.
Now let's get to it. As I prepare for my retirement and contemplate my return to North Carolina, where we first met, I'm afraid to say how long ago, I cannot help but think how profoundly different the environment is today for starting and growing life science companies than when we met some 20 years ago. What are the biggest changes you've observed over the years, and how has ARE both impacted those changes and been impacted by them?
Well, Leslie, first of all, thank you very much. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here with you. And thank you for your very kind comments on our amazingly talented and awesome team. And we thank you for that. And yes, 188 is a kind of a real jewel along the East Lake waterfront there. And I guess I want to thank you for your incredible efforts over many decades in this industry. I think when I read about you and think about you, I think you sometimes use the word fearless, and I think you've demonstrated fearless leadership over many, many years. And I think you also sometimes say, you know, you're very impressed by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And I think that kind of is like many of us in the life science industry. We're kind of just ordinary folk, and we've had a great chance to do extraordinary things. So thank you for all of that. So as I look back, you know, we did spend a whole lot of time together a couple decades ago in North Carolina. And I think when you think about the industry and we think about how we founded Alexandria on the concept, Michael Porter's famous clusterization concept, you think about this industry, which now, if you go back and you look when Genentech was founded in the mid 70s and then Amgen, I think 1980, we're now into really, you might even say, the third generation of this industry. The first in the latter half of the 20th century, the second in the first quarter of the 21st century, and now we're kind of moving beyond that. We think about really four elements in this industry that really create these vibrant clusters, one being world-class location, and Seattle has turned out to be that in many respects, although there are some asterisks there, I would say, and I'll come back to that. You also look for great and deep science and clinical capabilities and translational work. And I think Seattle clearly has that in a unique and amazing way, maybe one of the leaders of all in immunology, cell therapy. You also look at, is there a talent pool that is pretty awesome? And I think Seattle has over many years grown a great talent pool. You now have C-suite people who are moving from one company to another after they meet an exit or something like that. And so that becomes a really important factor. And then finally, you look at risk capital. And I think the risk capital has grown tremendously in the industry and certainly for Seattle. But there are some footnotes to each of these that, you know, we can talk about. But it seems to me the industry, as it moves into its third generation, is poised for some amazing opportunities. But I think on the downside, it's kind of amazing. There are 10,000 known diseases to humankind. And at the moment, we have more or less 500 addressable therapies and very few cures. So we really are we're still amazingly in the early innings. And I think the biology revolution, and then when you look at the intersection of biology and technology, which Seattle is really known for and kind of the poster city for, region for, that holds great promise for much more rapid breakthroughs in the coming years.
So still, when you think about then and you look at now, and maybe at the national level, even before we further delve down into Washington State and particularly the greater Puget Sound, what do you think the biggest change is? I mean, clearly we're seeing money come in, we're seeing COVID drive enthusiasm around what our industry can do. What stands out as the biggest changes?
I think I would say the ability to have novel science translated in a way that was far more difficult in the early days. I remember, in fact, a sad note, Alan Mendelsohn and I worked together to put together the first great joint venture in the industry back in 1984, Kirin Amgen. He represented Amgen, I represented Kirin. Alan just passed away very unexpectedly and was kind of a leader in this industry. But I think the ability to translate science much more rapidly has been, to me, the hallmark. And I think this industry has really captured the imagination. It to a large extent, is one of the untouched crown jewels of this country. When I say untouched, meaning luckily it's been able to flourish in a competitive marketplace. And I think those are and it's attracted just some of the smartest and most capable people. And I think those are the things that seem to me to be driving, the success today. But we always have to be careful, because there are a whole lot of folks in Washington that are looking to use this industry once again as kind of a whipping boy, whipping person for, their needs, and to try to, they don't recognize that you can do a few things to kill innovation, and we don't want to do it. We've seen that around the world in locations that have killed off innovation and moved to a more socialistic kind of medical environment. I mean, I love the country of Canada, but Canada struggled to even access vaccines because they had really gotten rid of much of their innovative research over many years, and it was a tragedy to see that happen.
So, amen to everything you just said. And still going back a little bit, when you look at the whole concept of ARE, which has been extraordinary. So I would say it has had, as a company, major impact in the leading clusters around the country. I think their ARE and those clusters are inextricably linked. I'm curious, what gave you the courage? What triggered you to start ARE? When you look at commercial real estate, most people, until recently, most companies have not just stayed away, they've run in the other direction. And then I'd say in the last year, there seemed to be a whole lot of people running toward it. What triggered it for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we first put the company together, Jacobs Engineering, particularly Joe Jacobs and Jerry Sidarsky, they were the lead in our $19 million modest Series A in 1994. We all had backgrounds in the biotech industry. Jacobs, as you know, does a tremendous amount of work in the architectural design, engineering, and construction of oftentimes many of the major biotech industry and pharmaceutical industry facilities. And we just came upon a notion that there was a need to really recognize that this was a kind of an asset class or a niche that needed some capital and needed some leadership. And that was the original seed. And then we took Michael Porter's clusterization concept, really as the foundation for the business plan, together with Jim Collins and his management techniques in Good to Great, and kind of put them all in kind of a bowl and mixed them up. And I remember at the IPO, so we formed the company in 94, $19 million, went out and started trying to acquire these oddball buildings, as you just mentioned, that nobody kind of really wanted. And when we did our IPO in 97, just 3 years later, on the New York Stock Exchange, we raised about 155 million. I remember reporters asking, how big could you get or this industry get? And I said, well, I don't know. We're now worth maybe $200 million. Maybe in a decade or two, we might get to $1 billion. Well, here we sit in 2021, our total market cap's exceeding, I think, about 35 billion. And I think what we've done is we've discovered a niche, a laboratory space niche, and then really over time, together with the industry, and the ecosystems really moved it to an asset class. And now it's a very well-respected asset class. And you find a lot of capital trying to flow in. But, you know, the buildings are complicated, but even more so, they're not simple to operate. There's been a recent example where one group, you know, who can build the facilities, but didn't, you know, necessarily do great operations, lost a lot of very valuable scientific experiments through failed power and failed backup power. And the people managing didn't really know what to do because they weren't trained right. And they, in the minus 80 freezers, lost all the scientific experiments there. So, you know, there are a lot of hazards to doing this. You gotta be kind of trained, and you gotta have a track record to do it right.
Yep. And you had to have some cojones pretty early on to jump into this big, wide unknown.
Well, I think anytime there's a new discovery, you know, whether it's real estate or technology or life science or ag tech or whatever, it just takes a theory, and then to try to, you know, as you know well, to try to get to a proof of concept and then see if you can scale it. And we were fortunate enough to be able to do that. And I, you know, really credit that to, you know, talent. We hired great people, no ego, who do their job every day and bring operational excellence every day. And we operate, like Jim Collins said, with kind of productive paranoia every day. How can we do things better every single day? And that's how we operate.
So what got you excited about Seattle? What brought you to Seattle and the greater Puget Sound? And how do you look at that now?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, you were born in Vancouver, Washington.
I was, yes.
So I grew up in Colorado, but early on, we formed the company in '94. We had an opportunity in 1996 to do a sale leaseback with the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center up on Pill Hill. We took that opportunity, and that was our first stake in the ground. We felt Seattle had, you know, again, in our cluster thesis, it's an excellent location, had deep science base, had some entrepreneurship, you know, some management talent and some risk capital. So we took kind of a risk in doing that. It was an older building. We converted it to labs. Carixa and Steve Gillis was one of our early tenants. He was, in fact, our first investment for Alexandria Venture Investments in 1996. So we kind of did both that year. We didn't have much money in the bank, so we had 3 loans on the property beside a modest amount of equity, but luckily it worked out. And we then expanded in the early 2000s to East Lake Union, and then shortly thereafter to South Lake Union. So we've always felt Seattle was a truly remarkable place. And I think today we see it as an amazing region. Again, this intersection of technology and life science is pretty big. I think the asterisk I would say on Seattle these days, if you look, Leslie, at, again, the location, it's a world-class location, great science, risk capital, there's a lot of it, but it's probably not nearly as strong as some of the other regions. So that's something that needs enhancement. And then management talent, you're seeing some great waves of management talent creating new companies, you know, people who started and grew up at Juno and, so many other companies have now helped seed and start other companies. And that's a really good thing. But I think governance in Seattle today is a big question. When you get to safety, when you get to, appropriate use of governmental powers, not to tax unduly, to encourage and to do the right thing in trying to govern the city, to do the right thing when it comes to the homeless situation. So there's a lot of issues Seattle has to face. And, Seattle was big in the news with the so-called CHOP zone and so forth. And it seemed to a lot of people outside of Seattle that Seattle wasn't taking control of, the situation and letting things get a little bit out of hand. And so those are some of the watchwords for the region that, we have to be careful of.
Thank you for raising those. They're incredibly important for us to pay attention to and to recognize. And we're fortunate, again, something Alexandria has done in each area is you provide leadership and organization in an ecosystem that has been invaluable, and I think will continue to be here. I'm kind of curious, in sort of the monopoly world, I look at John Cox, I think he's like must have loved Monopoly when he was growing up, or he's in heaven now, one or the other, because whenever I call him or whenever one of us calls him, he's either buying a piece of property, selling a piece of property, planning the next expansion. And clearly there's a lot happening on the east side. When I say the greater Puget Sound, I'm using that rather liberally, but thinking about Bothell and Canyon Park and what's happening. And I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about your thinking in moving sort of, not obviously you're still investing in Seattle, but going beyond into the suburbs. And it'd be great to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so first of all, a shout out to John. John worked with us on he was kind of the guiding light on the original sale leaseback with Fred Hutch. He's been really an icon in the region and really a pillar in the industry for so many years. You know, he in so many ways, I mean, he and Chad Robbins got together early on when Adaptive was being formed, and John kind of landed that relationship. We felt so strongly about what Chad was doing that not only did we lease them some space in 1551 East Lake, but we also took an investment. So John's been really a pillar and mainstay, not only for Alexandria, but really in the community. So thank you for that. So I think when you look at the greater Puget Sound area, I think you have to recognize, again, what I said. People are nervous about living in urban areas today that are not well governed. And, you know, there are some parts of Seattle, you go down to Pioneer Square, and it's a pretty rough area down there. And that's true of a number of locations. And I think naturally people have moved. There's been kind of a flight to some extent out of the city. Certainly, if you look at the city of San Francisco, there's been a gigantic flight out of the city itself because of that very same thing. That's not true of San Diego, for example. It's the opposite. So I think, you know, the East Side represents, certainly it's been anchored for, you know, many decades by Microsoft and many other great companies you find, you know, Amazon, Google, Facebook, all looking at, you know, having greater presence in those areas because they tend to be closer to maybe where the heart of the residential movement is these days. I think Canyon Park has always been I mean, CGen has been an anchor up there for, you know, decades and has done a great job of, you know, growing this ecosystem in so many ways. And so Bothell's been an important place, I think, today in the world of next gen manufacturing for gene therapy and cell therapy. I think my way of thinking, I think Bothell represents a great place for these companies to expand and create these critical, you know, facilities that are really needed. I think we've learned from COVID, I think two fundamental realities. One is our supply line, and now we're seeing this on the news every night, not just in medical products or you know, medical you know, therapeutics or whatever, but we're seeing it across the board. The supply lines are problems, and it's important that we manufacture and keep critical industries here. And I would even argue, you know, it's kind of funny, this infrastructure bill in Congress, which was the first bill that seems somewhat bipartisan oriented, except it's being held up by, I think, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party because they want the bigger package, which is the social reorganization. But it's sad about the infrastructure too. If you look at it, the infrastructure really is a 20th century infrastructure bill aimed at what we have in the 20th century. It's not aimed at the 21st century. It doesn't really go in big ways at next gen manufacturing for biotech products. It doesn't really do a great job of next gen manufacturing for semiconductors. We only manufacture here in the United States 11 to 13% of all semiconductors, yet they're used in literally everything we do. Why isn't that higher than, say, a rail spur in, you know, the middle of, I won't pick out any state, but let's say it's, Illinois or Chicago or Kansas or something like that. Seemed to me that's more mission critical, and leave some of those others to maybe state work. And then the second part, in addition to what COVID exposed, the supply chain issues, is really the future of medicine is complex medicines, next gen medicines, and it's the gene therapy, cell therapy, and beyond. And we need to have that control. And I think Washington, and particularly the Puget Sound region, has a great opportunity there. So sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, I think that's fantastic. And that answered so many questions that I had written down independently. And I think it gets to some of our core strengths and some of the needs we have in this area. And I know one of the things I've appreciated about the company, and by the way, while we're giving more kudos to John, who we love, he's a fantastic board member too.
Awesome.
And again, just John, I know you're out there listening, and thank
Well,
you.
he's been in the industry a long time, and he certainly has.
I didn't realize how long until you just said that. And honestly, I've had an increased understanding and appreciation of how long that you've been engaged in this region. And I just learned that Corixa was the first investment. And can I just say, the other gorgeous building, of course, we're thrilled with the new adaptive headquarters building.
Yeah, it's really
It's a tour de force, and it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I love seeing all the talent that has been shed from Juno and other transactions staying here, that I see a lot of sort of the young Turks who are putting that money back in, not only to their own companies, but what's happening.
Exactly.
So this incredible partnership. I guess the last question, and boy, time goes by fast, and I knew this would happen, but I could talk to you for at least an hour with no problem. And I hope we get a chance to do that at another point, getting caught up when we're in the same city at the same time. But thinking about big trends, I know, and by the way, I try to always listen to your JP Morgan presentation, because it really tells me what's going on in the industry, not just with your company. Thinking about big trends, as you're looking over the next decade, what are sort of the biggest, you've given a couple of these, what are some of the other big factors you're considering as you think about leaning into your existing 7 clusters or adding new ones?
Yeah, that's a really great and thoughtful question. And it's really a hard question to answer, because COVID has changed
so much.
We live, the way we think, the way we act. It's had such a fundamental and disruptive impact on not only our country, but much of the world. And things are just going to be different. People aren't going to be in the office, 5 days a week, at least for a number of years, I think. So as we look at the regions, and this is good news and bad news. It's good news for the existing clusters, because there is a high demand for talent. Talent is the critical factor in growing a company. Yeah, you need space, you need great science, you need risk capital, but if you don't have the talent, you can't do anything. And so that the war for talent is where it's all at. So if you're starting a company, you're not going to start in a place that doesn't have a talent pool. You can't build a company in just a new city that really, you can put a small company together and you can grow it to a certain extent, but you can't scale it in any meaningful fashion. So I think the clusters are going to become even more dominant, the existing ones, than they even ever have. And we see that in Boston. Our asset base today is, going on 60 million square feet, which is astounding. And when you think about, we have almost 15 million square feet in the Boston area, over 4 million, probably going to be 5 million in Seattle over the coming time. People are not going to go to Chicago to scale a company. They're not going to go to Denver, although, 2 very nice cities. I grew up in Denver. They're going to have to be in a Seattle. They're going to have to be in a San Francisco Bay. They're going to have to be in a San Diego. Otherwise, they can form the company and they can live and exist, but they can't scale. I think that's the biggest issue over coming time. And I also think, given the talent is moving around, given COVID, I think there are going to be more spoken hub situations with companies,
Yep.
not just a single. So you could have a Seattle company that has a San Francisco presence and maybe a Boston presence. And we already see that with a number of companies. Sana is a great example.
So I'm having to bite my tongue because I want to keep asking questions, but I know that we genuinely are out of time. Joel, what a fantastic chat. Thank you. I was thrilled when you agreed to do this with me. It's been a blast seeing you, and what a great, talk about great careers. Mine pales in comparison, but I'm just happy that we've had the chance to overlap in some of the great places in the country. And when I hear you, it makes me continue to feel bullish about our future, not only here in the great state of Washington, but around the country, that we will be globally competitive as long as we can manage some of the government forces out there to recognize the jewel in the crown.
Yep, both local, state, and federal people have to understand, and the industry has a responsibility to prove that this is a crown jewel of this country, and it's the only way ultimately you can manage and reduce healthcare costs by moving cancer from a death sentence to a chronic disease. And now we're on, as you know well, because of your background and expertise, we're on the verge of the neuroscience diseases where we've made pathetically little progress. And this industry is the only one that can solve that. You can't solve it by putting people in, homes so they live out the rest of their life with dementia or other neuroscience diseases.
Amen. Hurry up. We need that to hurry up.
Exactly.
Joel,
but it's been a real pleasure, Leslie. Thank you so much, and really for a great career on your end.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
Take care. Stay well.
Will do.
Bye-bye. I want to thank Joel again for participating in that wonderful chat. And now turn to something that is always really a fun part of this event. And I have to say, it's so hard not being in the same room together and not doing this in our usual way. But as we've noted repeatedly, there's really nothing usual about what we've been going through for the past 20 months. But I tell you, one of our greatest traditions with this summit is celebrating the great successes. Usually we try to pick the one or two really incredible accomplishments, whether it is a company that has managed to become public, whether it is, whether last year it was recognizing the incredible deal that CGen had just inked with Merck. And right now I have on the one hand, it's fantastic. We all feel good about it, but it's a huge challenge, which is to recognize in the past 12 months, we've had 7 companies that have moved and become public, that have made it into the public category. In addition, we have 3 new facilities that have opened up, and we've had 4 product approvals. So it's been quite a year in our ecosystem. I'm not going to have time to say something about each one of these. I just would like to go through and start by recognizing, in order of the date that they went public, are 7 new public companies. So here we have Silverberg and Laura Shaver. And I thought I was going to try and say something about each one of these companies, but I think what I'd like to point out is that 5 of the 7 clearly are in platform technologies that are being applied to some of the most challenging disorders, whether they are central nervous system, whether they are in the area of immune oncology, whether they basically apply across the board into proteomics, into, as Joel and I were talking about, the scale of what can be done now with these technologies is incredible. And the partnerships that are being forged to do it, amazing. Caitlin, if you could scroll through, we can see Sana and look at the market caps on some of these companies now. Next slide. Impel. Congratulations to Impel. We'll see their product approval. Next slide. Nautilus, who really is revolutionizing how we look at proteomics and use proteomics. ABSCI, what a year it's been for ABSCI as they get ready to open their new biotech center in Vancouver. I think, can we go back to Icosavax? So another one of the David Baker related companies, the technology and the discoveries that have come out, it's hard to believe that we're on the verge now, maybe have actually achieved the understanding of how proteins fold, and the thinking about that 20 and 30 years ago, recognizing that would revolutionize so much in drug discovery and development. It's pretty exciting to see we're almost there. Next slide. And certainly our most recent and our serial entrepreneur, Bob Azelby, bringing LEM public in Nothing Flat and working on neuronal excitability disorders. Bob, I'm excited to learn about what those are. So I want to say, first of all, congratulations. We wish we were together to lift a glass and toast all of our public companies, our new public companies. Next slide. I was so thrilled to be at both the Adaptive and the Just Evotech, the openings of both the new corporate headquarters down the street for Adaptive and at Just Evotech. Their plant is nothing short of amazing in terms of the new technology, the JPOD technology. And I really was honored to be able to speak at that grand opening. ABSCI, their biotechnology campus officially opened October 20th, but they are having their big celebration in a couple of weeks. So we don't have the pictures yet, but I just want to congratulate everybody on these incredible additions to our ecosystem. And then last but not least, oh my gosh, what is it we do, what we do for? To see the product approvals that have come forward this year have been just incredible. So congratulations to Adaptive, BMS, Impel, and Seagen and Genmab for really important discoveries. And before we move forward, I just want to say something about the TDEC test. And it relates, actually go ahead to the final slide, Caitlin. I haven't talked a lot about COVID today. It was a major focus of so many of our meetings, but I want to say I could not be prouder of our ecosystem, our community, the things that have taken place in Seattle and in Washington State across the board in dealing with COVID. That TDEC test that Adaptive has come out with, the importance of being able to distinguish between antibody immunity and T-cell immunity for COVID. We are all getting crash courses in vaccines and what that means in every aspect of dealing with COVID, from identifying the first case here, administering the first vaccine here, medical devices, new therapeutics, new testing services. I don't think anybody can hold a candle to what has been done here in the Pacific Northwest. So congratulations to everybody that has been involved in this effort. And with that, I would like to keep us moving and bring up now Sam Joe, a partner at Perkins Coie, who to introduce our upcoming panel on our funding panel. So Sam Joe is a technology business lawyer who focuses his practice on complex commercial and licensing agreements, as well as commercial technology, product platform development, integration, launch, and counseling. He really has a particular emphasis in machine learning and AI, which we know is incredibly important to our industry. And he has extensive experience representing startups and emerging growth entities. So please join me in welcoming Sam Joe.
Thanks, Leslie. Good morning. My name is Sam Joe, and as Leslie said, I'm a partner in the Technology Transactions and Privacy Group at Perkins, and we're really excited and honored to sponsor this morning's panel on Is the New World Order in Life Science Investing Here to Stay? Just a quick plug for Perkins before I introduce our panel monitor. Perkins is a full service law firm. We've got a very robust and long-standing life sciences and biotech practice, in particular here in the Pacific Northwest, that consists of three main interdisciplinary pillars. Our emerging companies and venture capital group that helps clients raise money in private and public markets. Our patent prosecution group, who has domain specific expertise in protecting life science intellectual property investments. And our technology transactions and privacy group, of which I'm a part, which supports the regulatory and commercial aspects of drug development and approvals, clinical trials, licensing. And these days, as Leslie mentioned, we find ourselves often at the intersection or the convergence of more traditional semiconductor-based technologies and life sciences, and a lot of the innovation that's happening in this space when it comes to things like product development, more broadly e-health or health tech, software applications, and related analytical AI or machine learning tools. So with that out of the way, it's with my great pleasure to introduce the panel monitor for this session. This is Kelly Lisbakken. Kelly is the Managing Director in the Healthcare Investment Banking Group at Wedbush PacGrow and head of the biopharma practice. Kelly joined Pacific Growth Equities in 2004 and has completed over 350 transactions with the firm, raising over $38 billion. Prior to Wedbush, Kelly worked at iCase, now part of Eli Lilly, on Cialis in the PDE4 program. She's a member of the Intellectual Property Committee at the Benaroya Research Institute, as well as the board of directors for the Retinal Degeneration Fund, which is a not-for-profit focused on making venture philanthropy investments on behalf of the Foundation Fighting Blindness. Kelly holds an AB in molecular biology from Princeton University, where she completed her thesis under the direction of Dr. Thomas Schenk, who is the Elkins Professor in the Life Sciences and former board member of Merck. So please join me now in welcoming Kelly.
Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for joining our panel. I have the sheer delight serving as your moderator, and also should mention I am a proud Seattleite by birth. Our panelists this morning join us from across the spectrum of the biopharma investment community. And with that, I'd like to kindly ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Augustine.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, so my name is Augustine Mojitos. I'm a research analyst at Janus Henderson Investors, focused on biotech, both on the private side and the public side. I have a science background, did a PhD developing kinase inhibitors for a rare genetic disease, and then worked for a number of years at RA Capital, followed by Eventide Asset Management in the Boston area before moving here to Denver to work with Janus.
Great. Over to Albert.
Thanks for having me, Kelly. My name is Albert Shaw. I'm a managing partner with Fraser Life Sciences, which has two investment vehicles that it focuses on biotech. One, our flagship venture capital vehicle. In addition, a recently launched public vehicle focused on small and mid-cap public companies. Prior to joining Fraser earlier this year, I spent 20 years at Vivo Capital. And prior to that, an MD PhD at UCLA in neuroscience and bachelor's and master's in electrical engineering from Stanford.
Great. Thanks, Albert. Michal?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Michal Silverberg, and I'm part of Novartis Venture Fund. I joined the fund about 4 years ago. The fund is solely sponsored by Novartis. That's our only LP, and we do investments solely in therapeutics. We start companies from scratch, and we follow them through IPOs, et cetera, until the exit. Novartis is part of our fund and gives us the funding, but we are not a strategic fund, and it's an important difference.
Thanks. And finally, Peter.
Probably helpful if I go off mute. Thanks for having me. Peter Thompson. I'm a partner at OrbiMed Advisors, math and physics background, medical oncologist by training, affiliate professor of neurosurgery at the University of Washington. OrbiMed, as folks probably know, is the world's largest dedicated healthcare investor across 3 lines of global businesses: venture capital, public equity, and structured debt and credit.
Great, thanks, Peter. All right, everyone, so let's talk about the New World Order. I think we've all observed an increase in the number of private financing as well as the overall size of said financing. So, one of the questions we're faced with is, what is driving this increase? And secondarily, do we think it can continue? And maybe Peter, you can start us off.
Well, I think there are a variety of things driving this increase. There are several trends that have been, evident in the industry on the finance side. One is the continued evolution of firms that canonically were public equity firms into earlier financings, initially on what we used to call, for us old people, mezzanine financings, which apparently don't exist anymore. And there are now much cooler things called crossover financings. And then, looking for earlier stage investments as a way to offset the pricing that has been going on for crossovers. And the first trend, I think, has been occasioned by an ongoing opportunity for what's effectively public-private arbitrage, where assets on the public market were worth some multiple of the same assets on the private market. Additionally, what we're also seeing is new players entering the space. Increasingly, I'm seeing and doing deals with firms, both firms that have traditionally been public, but also firms that have traditionally focused both on public and private investments, but on the tech side. And we're now seeing, an increasing, participation of these sorts of firms in financing. So I think that these, whether these trends, survive, what has historically been kind of a cyclical sort of, investment profile of returns in biotech, and how much of this is derivative of what's been, up until recently, a fairly robust bull market in this asset class, remains to be seen. But I do think that some of these things are here to stay, which from a company perspective is probably a good thing. It means that there are increasing sources of potential capital available for promising projects, both at inception and through their maturation towards becoming a public company.
Great, thank you. So, one of the things that certainly builds on this is just acknowledging the amount of money that's gone into the healthcare venture community. And I think, Albert, you shared it's 21 billion or so just in the first half of this year. Obviously, that's a lot of money coming in. And, a question would be, how has your investment process changed with all of this money coming in, not to mention the deal flow that's been out there and frankly, the overall market shift?
I mean, there's a tremendous amount of deal flow, but what's remarkable is even despite that huge bump in monies raised, we compare that to the budgets of the large pharma R&D, and it's still tiny, right? And a lot of the productivity we're seeing coming in terms of new molecular entities being approved by the FDA are coming from the biotech industry, which I think is a remarkable statement of the level of innovation, as well as the predictability of preclinical science to clinical science and ultimately approvable products, which is, I think, another underlying factor that drives some of the trends that Peter was talking about earlier. So, I think we're overwhelmed with deals. On the other hand, I think we're constantly excited about innovative science. So we're looking for teams that obviously are tied to great innovation and have prior experience to help us guide us through those journeys and become partners with them. So I wouldn't say our investment philosophy has changed, but obviously we're sorting through lots of deals and trying to make sure that we're finding those best of breed companies that we're excited about.
Yeah, have you changed your process at all, just given the numerical increase in the number of companies you're seeing? Have you had to hire a log more people? How do we think about just the overall throughput?
We've definitely increased the size of our team just to accommodate and make sure that we've got enough touch points, and also in a way that's geographically dispersed, right? So we have folks based in San Diego, we have folks based in Boston, with an eye towards making sure that we're covering all the major innovation hubs. And then simultaneously prosecuting that with a broader team of senior advisors and others. So I think, to the point, with that much information flow, we have to be adept and also figure out where to spend those resources appropriately. But I'm sure there are others on the phone who could comment on this as well.
Right. Well, maybe sort of yeah, go ahead.
I'm happy to add one comment. For us, we have been building ourselves more and more companies. Previously, we did more of the Series A's. Now we're going earlier. I think what has changed is the valuations dramatically has changed, and it's getting more and more competitive. So we need to move quickly. If we want a deal, we have to move quick. We have to put term sheets down quicker, and we have to also be willing to pay higher prices.
And Michal,
I think that's also a bit of a trend, is to pick up on Michal's point. And I had alluded to this in my opening comments, but that march toward earlier investing has now led several firms to begin to embrace creating their own proprietary deal flow and creating their own companies, not just kind of from what oftentimes was the case before, from out licensing of mature assets from pharma and building a clinical team around that, but even generating their own IP, which OrbiMed Advisors has done and others have done. As the basis of novel companies and novel approaches, and creating them effectively from whole cloth. That does have implications for staffing our organizations. Increasingly, I think you will see more operational talent within and working in direct collaboration with major funds. And I don't see that trend really changing that much. If anything, I see that perhaps growing.
Fully agree with that, Peter. And as your firm has done and you have personally done, our firm has done a lot of that as well, and moving towards company creation. And so we're doing a lot more than that we were doing even 5 years ago.
Yeah, let's talk about going earlier and earlier. So, again, public funds have migrated and going much earlier in the company life cycle. And Augustine, I think, you came to Janus certainly with that objective in mind. Can you walk us through the formation of the Biotechnology Innovation Fund and sort of why a major public complex would start to, focus a bit more on the private biotech scene?
Yeah, sure, Kelly. So, I mean, before I joined Janus Henderson, Andy and Dan, who are the other members of the biotech team, they were managing a large healthcare-oriented fund that invested primarily in public companies, but they had been meeting with private companies, for many, many years and kind of dabbling, let's say, in the kind of the crossover space. And what we ended up realizing is that over time, companies have been able to come public earlier in their life cycle. You used to need some clinical data, maybe even phase 2 randomized data. Now you can really go public on a preclinical idea with high quality investors and lots of capital, and then you can execute on the public side. And so I think, I don't know whether it's the reach for yield or investors just being more open to risk, but the fact of the matter is companies can go public now at a much earlier stage. And therefore, it makes sense for public market-oriented investors to look more towards companies that are private, because they will soon be public, right? And so it's just kind of a natural transition of what the market's been willing to accept from a risk perspective. And so that really created an opportunity for us to start a fund, dedicated to crossover investing, so that we could basically be in the deal flow, be looking at all the companies, learning, new spaces, whether it's, T-regs, that are up and coming, kind of the cell therapy and the Treg space, or something else, so that when those companies are public, we are prepared because we're managing a large public book of biotech companies, and so we really need to be on that cutting edge. And so I think it was just a natural transition of the opportunity set and how that's evolved over time. And so it made a lot of sense for us to start this fund, and we've been having a lot of fun investing in really quite innovative companies at earlier stages, but I think in a way that offers us an opportunity to also diversify our portfolio as well. And so yeah, and happy to kind of go deeper on one of those topics as well.
Augustine, one of the things you said is interesting, and I just wonder how that trend will continue, which is how accepting, at least in 2020, the public markets were to even fairly early preclinical stories Now, at some level, certainly in oncology, phase one, broadly stated, has become the new phase three in a sense. So one can see an opportunity from a public equity investor to basically have the benefit of that catalytic event as basically what's going to fuel their returns. But historically, there's been, ups and downs from a public market perspective as to whether it's too early for companies to be public when they're young preclinical companies. And we're starting to see some value compression there on the tape. But what are your thoughts about whether that, trend of being able to take lots of preclinical companies public at meaningful step-ups will continue?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that is very sentiment-oriented and sentiment-based, right? And if there's a risk-off environment on the public side, I think one of the easiest places to take risk off is, these companies that are very early and maybe don't have a meaningful value inflection point for a while. And so that's an easy place for public market investors to say, hey, look, I'm going to sell that and focus more on a company that's, post phase 2 data, going into phase 3 data, that's more of an M&A candidate, things like that. And so definitely depending on the market environment, this will shift. But I think there is some structural changes that have occurred, or there are some structural changes that have occurred that have enabled companies to go earlier. And one of them you mentioned actually kind of peripherally, which is like, for example, targeted oncology. It's become much more predictable to find a driver of cancer, targeted specifically, whether it's with a small molecule or an ADC, things of that nature, and have good results. And so people are just more confident that the preclinical data is translating into the clinic, whereas before this was less the case. And I think you're definitely seeing that in oncology. You're seeing it somewhat in rare disease as well, as we're identifying, great targets for rare diseases. And maybe over time, things like neurology or psychiatric conditions, which obviously right now are still in the very early stages of kind of biomarker development or biomarker-driven drug development and discovery, maybe we can get there with those indications, and then people will have confidence in investing early in those spaces as well. And so I think it's very much, kind of specific therapeutic area dependent, but also, risk on, risk off market environment dependent as well. I think it's a combination.
I'm also curious as to, just general thought on maybe building on that, not just some of the tools we've learned for drug development, but what else has enabled companies to go earlier? Is it just the flood of capital in the environment? Is it the, frankly, search for higher returns because the market has just been overall trending up? Is it because the science is just so disruptive? I'm sure it's some confluence of the three, but would be curious if anybody feels that there's been some extra weighting maybe in one of those categories versus another.
Well, I think that, Kelly, you hit on at least one of the topics, and there was another major for us in 2020, which is COVID, right? So as COVID slowed the world's economy down and people were looking for alpha, and then in an environment where obviously there was no inflation and the cost of borrowing money went to zero, people were looking for alpha, and COVID meant that our industry really benefited, as highlighted by some of the earlier panels today, in innovations, not just on therapeutics, but diagnostics and vaccines. And a huge amount of money was made by investors who participated in that. So I think those all positives, but coming back to the point Peter just made about value compression, we're seeing some of those trends come back to earth. I think there's been a over 30% drop, peak to trough on the XBI, which measures the health of small cap biotech. And a lot of the generalists who were coming into the space may now be looking at the inflation trade, which I think everybody's keeping an eye on what the implications are there for biotech. So I think we're back to basics in a lot of ways in the public markets. And so I think that's good in many ways, but it will, and we have a ton of public companies that need to finance. I think by count, it's close to 800 now. And so that's going to be interesting to see how that develops.
Albert, I think that's a great point. One of the other trends that I see that I'd be interested in your thoughts and Augustine's thoughts and Mihail's thoughts are, it's been, the panel has alluded to the risk reduction associated with precision oncology in the context of translatability of preclinical results to clinical results. Having said that, it seems that the public markets, broadly stated now, are looking at these assets through a couple of different lenses. One being that there's a sense that many of these pre-data were kind of priced to perfection with maybe unrealistic expectations of early ORR and clinical profile from phase 1 trials, and the other is, precision oncology at some level embeds a reductio ad logicum that has ever smaller market sizes being accessed by some of the emergent mutations. And I think as these assets have matured for some of the cadre of 800 public companies, which is kind of a frightening number at some level, I think there's been a shift as people have started to look at, well, but if this does succeed, what does this look like from a commercial perspective? I'd be very interested in your thoughts on that and the other panelists' thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. I mean, yeah, certainly one of the things you're highlighting, Peter, which I think kind of more broadly we can speak to, is just kind of the amount of competition in this space. Let's say as soon as an exciting target, whether it's a Trek or ROS1 or KRAS, obviously another very hot target. As soon as a very hot target is identified, you've got tons of capital, tons of teams deployed against that target. With an ever expanding toolkit, whether it's libraries or medicinal chemistry that you can hire abroad to really really quickly develop drugs against that target. It just, the speed with which you can get to a drug these days is much faster, and so the competition therefore is much heavier. And so then what does that mean ultimately for the market potential? If you're going to have 5 or 2, 3, 4, 5 Trek inhibitors approved, that's a really tiny market. How does that work, right? Is that a viable business from an NPV perspective? And I think, I don't know the answer to that. I think it's going to be very tough in some areas, and I think there will be a kind of a come to Jesus moment at some point where things are not going to go well for the companies that are maybe 3rd, 4th, 5th to market. And so I think that's a really important thing to consider as public market investors. I agree with you. A lot of stocks these days tend to be priced for perfection ahead of data. And so you end up seeing, the data not quite being perfect. And then there's a big sell-off, and then they have to finance. And so, but that's just like kind of what we deal with as public market investors. We these, when in the public market, sometimes, you don't get paid to take risks, data risks. Sometimes you do. And these things wax and wane, and you have to position accordingly. And that's kind of the fun of being in the space, quote unquote, the fun of it. But, it's just the kind of, it is, I know I can't change it. You just have to observe it and position accordingly. But I do think the industry does have to kind of contend with the fact that there's probably, and if I were, let's say on a management team, I would be thinking very carefully about targets and, really differentiation, because if you're not differentiated, you're probably going to be among a slew of other companies doing the same thing. And that long-term is probably going to be an issue. In the short term, the market can sometimes ignore that, right? But in the long term, I think that's definitely probably the biggest, besides drug pricing overhang and politics, I think the biggest issue long term from a kind of just an investor perspective is just the sheer competition in the space and how that fragments markets. So that's kind of bigger picture, and I don't know how that evolves over time.
Go ahead, Albert.
Yeah, one other comment I would just layer into that is that's one of the advantages why a number of us on this panel look at both private and public companies, because being able to see around the corner to what's coming privately when you have public exposures and understanding that competitive landscape, which is rapidly evolving and product life cycles are shortening as a result of that, I think is crucially important. And so for entrepreneurs who are thinking about where they're heading, it's important to talk to folks, investors, like the OrbiMeds of the world, to understand what the competitive landscape heading in. If there are 7 companies ahead of you, that may or may not, it's possible to distinguish yourself, but it's gonna be a lot harder to say your molecule or mousetrap is better than the others, and it may make more sense to go after some of these less solved needs.
Augustine raised an interesting point, Albert, that I'd really love to hear Mihail's perspective on with respect to Novartis, which is, How do you see commercial opportunity evolving in, let's say, precision oncology, and how does that influence what you guys look for on the venture side of Novartis?
Yeah, so we are actually agnostic to, we have our own preference to invest in areas that are not necessarily aligned with the priority areas of Novartis. We're free to do whatever we think. But more generally, I think that to your point of the markets seem to really value the innovation, right? Gene editing, things that are, not here maybe in the next 2 years, maybe 3 years, maybe 10 years from now, and it's easier for those areas to be very highly priced versus like another kinase, right? If we're talking about companies that have better kinases, and now there's good clinical data, is that really going to be exciting for investors to come in and to have another kinase? So I think a lot of it depends on really the field and what's of interest. But back to Novartis, where I think it is, we have an advantage from a fund perspective. We are capable of picking up the phone and asking some commercial folks on Novartis side to say, how is the landscape going to evolve in their minds? So not discussing any confidential information because we have a firewall between Novartis Venture Fund and Novartis, but more discussing trends. What do they think would be areas that there is unmet needs? How are the payers looking at some of these spaces? So payers are very important as part of the analysis, and that's where it's really great to have commercial people in your back pocket to be able to understand these dynamics. But it really varies. I feel it really varies between oncology, CNS, autoimmune. All these areas are very different. And also for us as Novartis Venture Fund, there are areas that we, like all of you guys who are financially driven funds, we like to invest in because we see the exits, looking historically at the history of the fund, we see the exits kind of better in certain areas and less in other areas. But we're, like all other funds, are going earlier and earlier in our investing in preclinical academic projects.
It's, I think, also a nice segue to perhaps a case study that we can do. So, Michal, I think you spoke at an event earlier this year about the seeding of Genti Bio, which was a company put together by both OrbiMed and NVF. Since then, you've announced $157 million Series A, which is no small feat. Again, since the seeding of that company through the most recent financing, what have you observed as sort of the evolution of the landscape? And maybe you can just walk us through even the origination story about how you found the technology and how you approached it, perhaps from a different perspective than, say, what your fund may have done 5-6 years ago.
Sure, and this is a classical. First, I should mention that since it was born in Seattle and based on SCRI, David Rawlings' work in the lab for many years, as well as Jane Buckner. So those from Benaroya, both have been very instrumental in this company and are still are. So the story with Genti started with the fact that we realized OrbiMed and us actually worked together in looking into the Treg space. And we looked at many Treg opportunities. We thought that's going to be an area of interest and look for technologies. And Genti was one of the technologies we looked at. Specifically, before we funded it, they were actually funded by Kaseebia, which was a company that spent a couple of years and millions of dollars and created a lot of data within what was called Kaseebia, now Genti. That technology basically went back to the academic setting, back to SCRI, and we were able to license it into Genti. And what gave us a really great head start, because there was a lot of data and a lot of knowledge, including talking with regulatory authorities as part of this. So at the time, we thought it was interesting. We then brought RA to the table as well. we did a seed financing of 20 million, and also, a year back, that was for us pretty substantial, putting 20 millions for, something we'll just take from the academic. And through the year, and this was just a year and like 2 months back, so 14 months back is when we did our original investment, we discovered that, there were more and more companies around us. The space is getting very competitive. One of the panelists, Augustine, I think you mentioned T-Rex as well. There's a lot of other companies that just came up in the area, and we decided that, together with management and Genti, that because we have a platform and the platform is very broad, to be able to really utilize and take the platform to extend and develop multiple indications. And that's why we decided to raise that amount of money. We also invested within Seattle, and we're going to be building this, the manufacturing side, because we really believe that manufacturing should be a key advantage for us in the future for Genti as well. So ended up having this $157 million of a round that was just closed in August.
Yeah, and I'd just like to casually comment once again that $157 million Series A may not be atypical in this environment, but certainly looking back 4 or 5 years is obviously a bit of an anomaly. Let's look at that within the context as we move towards an IPO, and certainly acknowledging it's been a pretty wild ride over the past 12 to 24 months. So from July of last year to June of this year, 100 biopharma IPOs listed on major US exchanges, which again is a mind-boggling number. Now, certainly since then, the market has changed a bit. And so would be curious about some of the panelists' comments on what happened and where are we going? And also, with sort of this change in the overall IPO market dynamics, how is this impacting some of your private financing decisions?
Yeah, if I knew the answer to that, for sure, I would be retired and not on this panel. I think, though, that I do take some hope from the fact that there's already been a pretty large drawdown. We actually analyze the data for kind of duration and size of drawdowns in the XP over the last about 10 years. And based on that data, at least one could argue we are approaching some kind of bottom. I think the other good thing is we are seeing spurts of M&A activity. Companies like Translate Bio, Trillium, and others that are getting acquired suggest that valuations, at least for these companies, became so low that pharma stepped in and said, we need to own these, right? So those are the kinds that things that we like to see. The major factor that makes it impossible to know for sure where we're headed is really, as I mentioned earlier, is inflation. And if inflation goes the way it has been going, we haven't seen an environment like this, and probably before biotech was really an industry. So that is going to be an interesting question. My hope is that enough of the generalists have rotated out of this sector already, such that further exiting is not likely to create another bottom in our sector. But I do think, to the general point of, for example, why we have a public fund versus a private fund, is that opportunities to make returns can exist in both sectors. For us, for OrbiMed, for Janus, and with all of those companies needing capital to raise, we're going to see dispersion. Some companies being able to access that with best-in-class teams, great technology, platforms, for example. Others may struggle more, and all of them need to get to those clinical catalysts ultimately to determine if they have products that can be approved or not by the FDA.
Great. Augustine, maybe some comments from the public side?
Yeah, I mean, well, look, yeah, Albert mentioned peak to trough, it's like close to 35% decline in the XBI. August 19th was the low at about 118. It's actually the biggest relative decline in the history of the XBI that goes back to 2006. And so while, the market is making all-time highs and tech investors are making money and people invest in Tesla and Bitcoin and everyone else is doing well, biotech is really in a bear market. And so I think, one of the things that gives me some level of hope is like Albert mentioned, the fact that we're at that point right now. And so, we have some signals of bottoms, but, we also have political overhang that remains an issue. We have a flood of paper. Today there was an IPO, it's up a little bit. So, you still have a lot of, financings that need to happen. Every company that goes public has greater expenses. They're starting, we talked about them being public when they're preclinical. As they start running clinical trials, they start spending a lot more, especially if it's a gene therapy or cell therapy company. The CMC costs and alone are, dramatic. And so all these companies are going to need a lot of capital. And so there becomes a sense of investor fatigue to keep deploying that capital if that capital is not yielding a return. And when things get really bad is when you start seeing outflows in the funds. If I don't have the capital to deploy, then I mean, there's nothing I can do. And so I don't think we've seen that yet, really. I think people are just kind of holding their ground and hoping for things to start to improve. But I think what we really do need to see a lot more of. We started to see a trickle of M&A, but we need more of it. It's still been quite a lull this year relative to other years, and I think the loss of exclusivities that a lot of the big pharma and big biotech companies are facing, are still there, and they do need to replace a lot of revenue, especially if drug pricing becomes a bigger concern, right? And so I think hopefully we'll see some more M&A, but I would like to see more M&A to really help redeploy some capital back into the sector, which we're going to need a lot of if we're going to continue to finance these companies.
So we can acknowledge that we're certainly in, or at least near the bottom, or perhaps approaching a trough. What else besides M&A do we need to see, or do we think we can see in the near term to help to bring us back and hopefully at least equilibrate or start to move up into the right?
And continued FDA approvals, some good product launches would help, right? And that is one of the issues. We do need to get out from COVID and continue to enable patients access, which has been really challenging for the last year. And a lot of companies that launched during COVID really suffered, right? So I think those are some of the things that we're more broadly looking for. And it will certainly be helpful to have a permanent FDA commissioner. And it sounds like that's headed in the right direction so far.
Yeah. So maybe just to play devil's advocate, I know it sounds relatively negative on the market, and yet we're still seeing IPOs get done, right? Another one got done today. And while pre-money valuations have certainly come down, having lived through 2010, 2011, I think we would be rejoicing at this general pace and certainly some of these general valuations. So it is interesting to contextualize some of that, though certainly many of these IPOs are the product of these crossover rounds that seem to make the IPOs then self-fulfilling prophecies. But as companies continue to move towards these public markets, and I think we alluded to this fact, there are almost 800 publicly traded biopharma companies in the US right now. I mean, that's a lot. You can compare that just back to 2017 when we were only at 450. So we're close to doubling here in a pretty short amount of time. Can the universe sustain this number of companies? And if not, how do we rationalize what happens? M&A is certainly a way to take some off the table, but I don't think M&A is going to take 100 companies off the table next year. So what happens to that effect?
Well, I think Albert alluded to it. Oftentimes in these markets, from a public perspective, you start to see more activity, but selective with respect to the 800 firms that you referenced. Perhaps not all of them have technology or assets that make a lot of sense to continue to underwrite. As we pointed out, many of them went public while they were still preclinical. And I suspect that there will be a bit of a winnowing in terms of access to and cost of capital with respect to the refinancing needs of those 800 companies.
Yeah, and it's certainly going to be interesting to see. I mean, obviously they can't all be supported by the capital that's out there, but whether these just turn into complete wind downs or whether we see an uptick in reverse mergers, or we've bandied about the idea of roll-ups for quite some time when you have so many single product companies. The affectionate joke is one biotech plus one biotech equals 1.5 biotechs, or perhaps even 0.5 biotechs. But on some level, you're going to have to do something about the number of companies, and that certainly is a worthwhile consideration for private companies who are looking to raise capital. You're out there battling against 800 public companies, which doesn't even begin to consider the number of privates that are out there. So, as a company, and maybe to our two more private-oriented panelists, what can you do to stand out? What are you specifically focused on? How are you handling all of this deal flow, and maybe words for our audience in terms of what they can do to try to step away from the crowd?
Well, I think some of the old basic rules apply, and it's been alluded to by some of the other panelists. Biotech and science in general oftentimes has surprising results that you don't have yet, and some of them may not be exactly what you thought or thesis supportive, all of which ends up being a referendum on the strength of the team and the ability to both respond to data and be able to potentially pivot towards areas where the science and the data are more supportive. So the old analogies of backing the jockeys more than the horses, I think, will continue to be the case. I do think that we had kind of noted both the promise and the current challenges associated with an asset class that's been highly valued for a while, which is precision oncology. The fast follower dynamics that Augustine alluded to, and how the public markets are starting to look at these things with respect to their early stage results, as well as ultimately the commercial opportunity, is focusing, I think, some increased attention back towards larger indications, with the hope that either novel technologies applied there or, precision neurology, precision autoimmune and inflammatory, precision this, precision that, will work. I think my own personal view is that we're still in the early innings of trying to effectively reverse engineer 19th and early 20th century medicine, which categorized things phenomenologically into categorization based on the driving biology in a manner that lends itself to the same heuristic we've used in oncology. But I do think that there will be, some increased interest in things like Genti and other companies that are focused on areas that might serve larger markets.
Yeah, the other part of back to basics I would focus on is things that ultimately provide transformative benefit to the patient. So just putting my physician hat on, it's very easy to say, I'm going to produce this product's going to hit this target, but take a look at what's available. And don't forget that what you have to demonstrate is not just that something can hit an endpoint for an FDA regulatory approval, but it's actually going to be something that can change the standard of care. I think the good news is the vast majority of companies that are seeking funding acknowledge that, but for those that don't, I think that's where the trouble will come, especially with the drug pricing pressures that were talked about earlier.
Yeah, and it's certainly worth observing not only what's already approved, but what's also in development. Many people often compare themselves just to the other things within their specific mechanism or modality. And you kind of have to think about it across the spectrum there as people are tackling diseases. What could be approved by the time that you are approved, even if it's not already there? You're competing for patients in clinical trials just as much as you'll be competing for patients in the commercial market. Maybe sort of a last question as we wrap up here. We always know oncology gets a pretty broad audience here, but maybe with Michal, what other therapeutic areas are you seeing an uptick in, from a general prediction perspective, any therapeutic areas or specific disease states that you think are going to see a higher level of private interest in 2022?
I think autoimmune is a big one. I think autoimmune, there's more and more, autoimmune, and then I look at it also from a technology perspective, looking at platforms in gene editing, as I mentioned before, or cell therapy, different modalities. It's not necessarily the therapeutic area, but also what kind of tools, what kind of technologies do we have today that will enable us to go to larger indications? Because what was done with cell therapy, for example, for oncology, and was proven that, it could cure, the same kind of concept going out broader into other areas is what we're, betting on. And again, Genti happens to be another example for that one.
Great. Other panelists, any other therapeutic areas you're seeing more or even less of?
Yeah, I would think protein degradation is obviously huge. Hitting, targeting undruggable or formerly undruggable targets, especially with small molecule approaches that are obviously, convenient and have a good target product profile. I think that's an area that's going to see a lot of continued interest for sure.
Great. Perfect. All right, folks. Well, I think we're near the end of our time. I want to thank all of the panelists for their participation here, and certainly everybody who's been joining in from home. With that, I'll turn it back over to Leslie and the team. But again, thank you all, and look forward to the next panel, which is going to address one of the topics we hit on here, which was the personnel shortage and how we staff all of these 800 plus biopharma companies as we move into the future.
Kelly, thank you. Thank you so much for orchestrating such a fantastic panel. And I want to thank each of you, Peter, Augustine, Albert, Michal, for sharing with us so much information in such a fast way. Kelly, you promised it was going to go quick. It went faster than I thought. And I just could not be more grateful for your participation. Thanks for helping educate us in this area. Certainly, there's a lot of interest in everything that was discussed today. We're now going to take a short 10-minute break. We will start back up at 9:45 with our final panel. So take a break, folks, or join one of the networking rooms.
Everyone.
In progress.
Hope everyone enjoyed the break. I am Dale Willard, Business Development Manager at Life Science Washington. I'd like to introduce our sponsor, Wade Patterson from Sinobiological, to introduce our next panel. Wade, you want to take it away?
Thank you, Dale. Hello, I am Wade Patterson from Sinobiological, and we are very pleased to sponsor the panel on the insatiable demand for life science talent. For those of you who are not already familiar with Sinobiological, we are a research, reagents, and services provider specializing in recombinant technology and CRO services. Over the last year, we've contributed greatly to the fight against COVID-19 by supplying many talented researchers in the region with reagents for the research of SARS-CoV-2. And our product catalog has grown to include over 7,000 recombinant proteins and over 13,000 antibodies. As a one-stop reagents and service provider, we are always happy to assist other Life Science Washington member organizations with anything that they may need. If anyone ever has any questions about our products and services, please feel free to contact me directly anytime via email or LinkedIn, or you can also get in touch with me by inquiring on our website. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the panel moderator, Dr. Leslie Alexandra. As President and CEO of Life Science Washington and Executive Director of the Life Science Washington Institute, Dr. Alexandra leads the development and execution of strategies to strengthen the Washington State's life science industry and build ecosystem vibrancy. A 30-year veteran of the healthcare and life science industries, Dr. Alexandra has held leadership roles in companies ranging in size from startup to Fortune 500, prominent research institutions, and nonprofit organizations. While president and CEO of the North Carolina Biotechnology Center, Dr. Alexandra championed the development and execution of new jobs across North Carolina, a strategic plan for growing the economy statewide through biotechnology, resulting in tens of millions of dollars of new state investment in biotechnology and thousands of new jobs. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Alexandra.
Thank you, Wade, and thank you, Sinobiological, for sponsoring this session. As you might imagine, this one is really near and dear to my heart. Workforce has been an area I've been involved with, as you heard, for quite a while. I want to set the stage for our panel today before I turn it over to each of our panelists. As I move to them, I will introduce each one of them individually, but I thought I'd just start by giving you a little bit of background of how Life Science Washington has been engaged with this topic of talent and workforce really from before I arrived here. When I came in 2016, already underway was something called the Governor's Advisory Council on Life Sciences and Global Health. And as this was kind of your typical group of leaders throughout the community from every sector, every major institution that needed to be there was represented by top leadership. Hans Bishop, who at the time was with Juno, really was one of our leaders from biotech, representing our voice at the table. I came in as a co-chair, taking over from Chris Rivera, my predecessor. The group had already been meeting on topics related to life sciences and global health for probably 6 months. And what had already become clear is the first time the group met and went around the table and everybody said, what do you need? Of course, it was about how do we grow these sectors in our state? 100%, the number one challenge that everybody raised was workforce. The issues might have varied a little bit in terms of what the needs were, but it was big time important, to the point that Maura Little, who also co-chaired this council, was our, what we call our sector lead in the Department of Commerce, advocating and working on behalf of our industry, was able to find some resources and hire Techonomy partners to do a deep dive really into, it was an incredibly thorough study on supply and demand of all the positions that we needed in life sciences, and then the overlay with global health. Timing was great because this study was just coming out as we were getting ready for my first board retreat, which came up in the fall of that year. We invited Mitch to come in and talk, and he's going to share a little bit of what he learned then and where we are now. But what came out of that was really, in our strategic plan, a priority of workforce development and talent recruitment. And I will tell you that for the past 5 years, Life Science Washington, working with many of you who are on this, in the audience today and in our community, in various constellations, we really worked on 3 or 4 areas. Time does not permit my delving into each one of them, but whether it was putting the science back into STEM to build awareness of our industry when we were being drowned out at the elementary and junior high and high school levels by our friends from big tech and aerospace, to new training programs at community colleges, to career development workshops for grad students and postdocs, a whole litany of activities. Many of them were things that we could lead at Life Science Washington, and that did not require as much direct engagement from our industry as a whole. And as I said earlier in my remarks, the challenges were different then than they are now for our mature ecosystem cluster. So I am looking forward to both the comments that each one of our panelists are going to make to start the conversation, but particularly the dialogue. I really picked these panelists because each one of them brings a very unique and relevant perspective to today's discussion. So let's get on with it. First, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Mitch Horowitz. Mitch is Principal and Managing Director of Techonomy Partners, a global leader in research analysis and strategy for innovation-driven economic development. Mitch is nationally known to us, particularly in the leading bioscience clusters. He's worked with over a dozen states, major metropolitan areas, really focused in technology-based economic development with a huge focus in the life sciences. He's authored studies with pharma on best practices and international competitive issues, and with bio on bioscience development, trends, STEM education, and industry university partnerships. So Mitch, take it away.
Great.
And give us some of the highlights of the data.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
We'd be happy or afraid.
Well, data is always an interesting benchmark. But Leslie, I first want to say it's so great to be back with Life Science Washington, and really appreciate the opportunity to kind of give you, set the stage for what I think is going to be a very consequential discussion here today. So this work that we're going to be presenting, the quick data snapshots, come from recent work that we've done with CSBI, which is the Coalition of State Biosciences Institutes, with pharma. And then as Leslie, you mentioned, back in 2017, we had the opportunity to take a really deep dive in Washington State for the Department of Commerce. And I think the key takeaways really come down to a few key bullet points. One is our economic growth and prosperity is becoming more and more dependent on STEM job creation, But when you look at how the US is doing relative to other global competitors, we're falling behind. And ultimately, it's putting our overall competitiveness in innovation at risk. When you then take a deeper look at where's the life sciences, you're going to see the dependency on STEM is even greater. And so the risks are actually amplified. And across the nation, in response to these challenges, we're seeing life science industry recognizing the challenge and stepping up and working in a very proactive way with education institutions and a variety of other types of groups. When you then bring it even further down to Washington State, what we found back in 2017 was many areas of very specific gaps in the talent and workforce system. And what we recognize even back then is that while you can have success in recruiting and it could be very helpful in growing an individual business, as an overall sector, you just can't recruit your way out of the need for STEM workforce and talent creation. And we'll see that as we go forward here. So let's first talk about the demand for STEM jobs. You can see it clearly in this slide. 9% of projected employment growth over the next 10 years is in STEM occupations. This is across all industries. Only 5% in all occupations. So you can already see that we are going to have a very differential pace of growth in these jobs. And that's really good for this country because STEM jobs pay a lot more money. And when we think about how do we have economic prosperity, how do we have inclusive growth and really raise everyone up, having STEM jobs and the availability of it really stands out. But we're facing headwinds in the US. First thing, look at K-12 performance. From 4th grade, we go from 11th and 8th in the world. By 9th grade, we're standing at 37th in math, which is, it's just unfashionable, and 18th in sciences. Then when you start moving into, for the country, into looking at what's happening in post-secondary education and higher degrees, you can see that our graduates, unlike our competitors, are much more focused on social sciences and less in engineering and natural sciences. And then when we take it to yet a third graphic here, and we look at how we're able to reach the growing talent base, which increasingly in this country is found in minority populations, Black and Latinx populations, Asian populations, and you look at what is the percentage of the population, and then you look at in bachelor's degrees and master's degrees and doctoral degrees, you begin to see that we just are lacking in diversity in science and engineering degrees in this country. And so leaving behind a lot of our population. When folks look at this on the global stage, the Bloomberg Innovation Index, which looks at well over 200 factors, has recorded that in just the last 8 years, we've gone from number 1 to number 9. And that slippage is really due to our really poor positioning in post-secondary education, where we're rated 47th. And that looks at things like college enrollment and graduation rates, education attainment, and the science and engineering graduates in the workforce. So we can already see that our competitiveness is going to be a challenge. When you look at it relative to the life sciences, and I know this is no surprise to any of you who are growing your businesses, whether you're a new startup or whether you're an established company, is that first, the life sciences is a terrific sector for this country. It has a broad range of jobs across all kinds of skill levels and activities. But when you take a deeper look at it, you begin to realize that relative to other industries, much more dependent, the life science is much, much more dependent on higher education. So you can see here that high skills in life sciences, which are bachelor and above, represents 47% of entry-level jobs compared to 27% for the entire country. And when we looked with CSBI recently at kind of the job titles and the key occupations that are really driving this and doing it in a kind of more industry vernacular, you could see it across a broad range of skills here, from medical technicians and medical scientists, all the way through data scientists and regulatory affairs, as well as in the manufacturing production occupations. So this is real. I mean, these are real jobs with important implications for whether the industry can compete. When we dove in for Washington State, first we surveyed industry, and they already told us that there were real shortages in informatics, engineering, marketing, and sales positions, all of which required a higher degree. But then as we looked at it from all the data that we had, including job openings, the surveys, and occupational data, as well as what Washington State was producing, we began to see a set of high demand occupations and ones that had real misalignments between supply and demand. I'm not going to read the chart here, but you can see it. So it does stand across engineers and IT and production workers. And so this is a real challenge in Washington State. We've updated more recent trends about where we stand in the production of talent and the generation of talent. And you can see that in Washington State, we're on par with the country, which again is behind the rest of the world in the focus on life science degrees. But in recent years, there's been a real slippage in the overall degree generation. Washington State's only grown 9%. The rest of the country has actually grown 13%. And when you break it out into the skill levels, yes, there's been a big bump in associate's degree, which is important, but it's actually a very small base in Washington State in terms of degrees. Where you really are falling behind is in the bachelor level degrees, and then and also in the master's level. And so where this brings us to is that we have a situation where the life sciences demand for STEM talent is significant and rising. Washington State just isn't keeping pace in talent generation. And one thing that's real important to understand about this is that the situation is only going to get worse because the demographics are such that the next decade is going to have far fewer students attending college and graduating from college, just given where we are in terms of key birth rates. And so, within Washington State, you can't just recruit your way out of this. And what we're seeing across the country is that business is engaging. So 78% of the over 1,000 life science executives that were interviewed and surveyed by CSBA reported that their companies are participating in formal partnerships with educational institutions. And this includes curriculum development, it includes mentorship, it includes internships. It's a host of activities that industry is doing with them. We're going to hear a lot today about North Carolina, so I'm not going to steal anyone's thunder here. But in Maryland, my home state, we've been doing some creative things. We have a program that allows industry consortium to identify critical skill needs, and we then provide grants for it, and they engage educational institutions called Maryland Earn. Massachusetts, we had a chance to look at the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center, and they probably have one of the most effective internship programs that goes to particularly their small and mid-sized companies, their emerging innovation companies, and connects their talent base with their companies so that these students get retained and see an opportunity to stay in Massachusetts. And even just your neighbor, Oregon, we're doing a bunch of work there these days. And many of you may know, Oregon Bio is built around upskilling and industry certifications. That's a big part of their efforts. And they've had past experience where they've actually helped transition workers from outside of the life sciences into the life sciences through these education programs. So what we see from the bottom line and kind of set the stage for this discussion is that these issues around talent and workforce for the life science industry, They require both increasing STEM graduates and employers coming together to develop industry-based workforce and training initiatives. So Leslie, I look forward to the discussion here, and I'll let you take it back over and look forward to contributing as we move forward.
Thanks, Mitch. That was perfect. Now it gives me incredible pleasure to introduce an old friend of mine, Russ Reed, who has led a national biotechnology workforce effort for 16 years. Based in Winston-Salem, the National Center for the Biotechnology Workforce is a part of North Carolina's community college system and focuses on achieving best practices for bioscience workforce training. Having previously served in executive positions for Burroughs Wellcome and Glaxo, and as CEO for Kuchera Pharmaceutical Company, Russ is also PI on 2 NSF Advanced Technological Education grants, the Biosciences Industry Fellowship Program and Biomedical Emerging Technology Applications, which is appropriately, particularly for North Carolina, it's focused at the interface between biomedical devices and tissue engineering. I don't think there's anyone in our country who knows more about the types of training programs we're interested in learning more about and potentially implementing here in Washington. So Russ, take it away.
Hi, Leslie. Great to see you. I almost feel like you're in North Carolina. Leslie, a little bit of the history of North Carolina, because for you and I, this takes its way back 20 years. But myself personally, my first engagement with North Carolina was with Burroughs Wellcome back in the late 70s. And I was a young man at that time, and I was involved with a really interesting company called Burroughs Wellcome at the time, and it was developing antivirals, and it was looking into the future at that time. And so I think what I learned at the very, very beginning of my career was the power of the RTP region. I would fly down from Montreal, Canada. I was working in the Canadian company at the time, and we would come in and we would see this beautiful complex called RTP, which you know well. But what makes RTP, I think, pretty much a special place is the fact that it's the intersection of great companies. You've mentioned a couple, but there are many, as you know. And the one thing that intersects everything there between the universities, the research universities, let's say our colleges, and I think our trade association is the North Carolina Biotechnology Center. And you were the CEO of that particular complex, as you are the CEO of Life Sciences Washington. So very early on in the 80s, North Carolina set a strategy for workforce. And that workforce strategy has been emulated. It has been super powered by the interactions with legislators. It has been supercharged by forming a group called North Carolina BioImpact, which actually takes all the educational institutions that are local to RTP and some of the other regions. When I say that, I mean the community college system, for those of us who do biotech, and we're all networked, and we're networked very strongly and very closely. We meet every quarter. We have great meetings in the biomanufacturing section of BioImpact. So I think, Leslie, what has happened is North Carolina has set a strategy in place. This strategy has been in place for almost 40 years now. And I think it's the very, very good interaction of the North Carolina Biotechnology Center being a neutral party. And I think that's the key. Although it is state funded, it is a neutral party. So what it's doing is it's trying to make sure that it invests in young companies, it invests in university research, and invests in the workforce. As with respect to what Mitch mentioned, and I think it's really important, I am a co-investigator of Innovate Bio, which is a National Center for Biotechnology. And we were very active in the CSBI report. And I think that what has come to light with that report is everybody, every state is going through a workforce issue. There aren't enough bodies. And in the life sciences, it's particularly acute. So I'm not going to say much more now because I'd like to get into the dialogue. But Leslie, thank you, a million thanks for inviting me on this panel.
Russ, I'm looking forward to asking you a couple questions because I need you to really frame up how the companies played a role in bringing about that and what they did just hands-on with the training. But we'll come back to that.
You bet.
Many of you in our audience may be well familiar with Mike Schutzler, our next speaker. Mike, gosh, has been the CEO of WTIA for a number of years. Their membership is over 1,200. He is an entrepreneur, an engineer, scientist, science buff, and first-generation immigrant. And he has personally invested in more than 30 startups, served as a coach and advisor to more than 100 executives. And one of the reasons I asked Mike to be part of this today is because WTIA has created a model, has really taken on workforce challenges that are, as he will tell us, at a whole nother scale, numerically and demographically than what we're facing in the life sciences. And Mike, I have so much appreciation for what you have done with Apprenti and what you did in terms of bringing on new slots at the university to train computer scientists. I thought it was important for our community to hear from another association leader right here in our state what can be done when you really lean into something. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me, Leslie. Appreciate it. I think because this is not my normal audience, I'm going to just take 1 minute and just highlight a couple of things that are a little different between your industry and mine. In the United States, there are 500,000 tech companies. 400 of them are public. So that gives you automatically a good idea about what the shape of our industry is. Our industry has roughly a 40 or 50-year history of ejecting talent out of large corporations who go off to start their own companies, and then they poach the talent out of their former employers to go staff those companies. After a while, some of those companies become successful, and then they get reacquired by the large corporations and become the talent in the large corporations again, and then round and round the circle goes. Our industry, however, is not really an industry. It's really a fallacy to think of the tech industry as a sector because it's actually much better to think of it as a talent cluster. There are more tech jobs outside of tech than there are in tech. Andreessen famously said software ate the world. And it's pretty obvious when you go to the University of Washington and you go look at their life sciences buildings, half the people in there are working on computers and the other half are doing something with a test tube. And that's actually how the math works out. There are more jobs in retail and financial services and in life sciences than there are in the tech industry for software developers, cybersecurity analysts, IT support specialists, and so on. To give you a sense of the scale of the problem that Leslie pointed out, there are 3.5 million open tech jobs in the United States that have not been filled for at least 12 months. And the entire production of all universities, all colleges, and all for-profit institutions like coding camps produce less than 300,000 new graduates a year. So we're kind of in trouble. To give it even better, more narrow focus in the state of Washington, there are approximately 50,000 students in the University of Washington, and the entire production, including undergrad and grad on an annual basis, is 800 new people. So we're just not gonna be able to recruit our way out of this problem any more so than you are. And so we started looking at this problem some years ago, and Leslie pointed this out. We really worked very hard at fixing the problem at the 6th grade level and the K through 12 level in general. 6th grade happens to be the critical break point for us. That's going to be about a 50 to 100-year program to solve that problem. We're just not going to solve it in the near term. So we went upstream and we decided to help the University of Washington raise a bunch of money to double the capacity. Not that long ago, it was 600 grads a year, including undergrad and graduate students. We helped them raise in total of public and private funding, close to $200 million to build a new building, to get new staff, to get operating funding. And the outcome of that will be approximately 1,200 students when everything's fully operational. So the return on investment in the near term is a rounding error. So we shifted our focus to see if there was another way to solve the dilemma. And our answer, and I'm happy to answer more questions about this, our answer, it was born out of an interesting analysis in the same way that Leslie's team did this analysis in that workforce that Mitch did such a great job of laying out. We did the same thing in 2015, and we had a giant epiphany. We realized that the vast majority of the jobs in tech don't actually require a computer science degree. And in interviewing the hiring managers and the heads of HR of hundreds of companies across the country, we came to the realization that we can, in fact, reskill an adult workforce if only we could find the people that had the core competencies. And we have. We've been running a beta test for roughly 4 years in an apprenticeship program. And our thesis is we've got 3.5 million unfilled jobs, and there's, depending on how you do the math, somewhere between 10 and 20 underemployed and 10 or 20 million underemployed people in the US. Comfortably 2 to 3 million of them are trainable. So we're on a mission from God now to retrain the adult workforce in the United States. And we've proven that we can take forklift drivers, Uber drivers, we can find people who are baristas, we can find people with history majors or masters in fine arts. And as long as they've got 8th grade math skills and they know how to work well in teams and can solve a problem, we can train them how to do the technical skills in the job. And so I wonder, when I was looking at your math, how many of those jobs really require a master's degree or a PhD? I'm sure some of them do, but I bet there's a lot of other jobs where you will find, just like we did, that there's a ton of talent out there. They just need to be trained. It might take a year, but that's a way faster return on investment than waiting 20 years for the next cohort of students to come out. You're on mute, Leslie.
Michael, that was perfect. And I'm going to punt right back to Russ now to talk about finding those workers, because as I recall, and Russ, not that I want to get into the math with you, but I think it was 30 years ago when we put in place the strategic plan to do the workforce initiative. And right at that time, what happened in furniture, textiles, and manufacturing to give us that workforce for biomanufacturing?
Yeah, I think that was a big shock to the North Carolina economy, Leslie, and we heard it consistently in our work in the early 2000s, that essentially we were losing that economy, and so we had to make a radical change, a radical shift, and we had to be able to be geared up and ready to be able to convert people, as Michael has said. And so we went into looking into ways and means using the community college system of upskilling or changing people's professions. So, taking them from having been an expert maybe in furniture making, those skills are really, really good skills. We found that we were able to take a short training program called BioWork, and that's a 12-week program. And essentially what they learned was basic skills. And Michael hit the nail on the head here. These people were unbelievably disciplined in what they did. So they had the discipline. The question was, could they learn the technical side of biotech, lab skills, so forth? And they did it very well. So that was one of the key findings we had. And then, of course, when biomanufacturing started to really progress in North Carolina, and we needed to have more and more folks, trained up quicker, the BioWork program became extremely popular, and it is very much to this day. So I would say that it's a short program. It's not a long program. It's anywhere between 12 to 14 weeks. It's a good skills program. People are learning those basic skills that they need in order to switch over. And we have countless cases of people who have gone through the program and been able to get very, very nice paying jobs and very secure jobs, I might add.
I'm going to just stay with you for one more question. And that again is getting to the role of the companies. As I recall, there were some of the companies who, by the way, were screaming at the governor, were screaming at me, if we can't find more people, we're not going to expand here. We love North Carolina, great place for our businesses, but you know what, over and out. And this is when they still had the option of going someplace and finding that talent. And I remember people like Hal, right, from Biogen, some of the big companies that were already doing manufacturing either had executives retiring or donated executives to engage with the community colleges, and people such as yourself who came from industry and then devoted themselves to building the courses. How important was that, or has that been?
Well, I think that was extremely important because, and I do remember Hal well, and I'm glad you brought him up. I hope he's well. And it's been some time now.
It's been a long time
that he's been involved with us, but sure. I mean, essentially, understanding what the skills were and breaking them down, taking the jobs and breaking them down. You remember those windows on the workplace, and then taking the actual job positions. And that had to be guided by industry. We had to be in sync with industry. So it was extremely important, Leslie. And we spent, as you remember, I mean, I came in maybe the early 2000s, but I can remember spending a lot of time with Kathleen Kennedy, John Balchunas, sitting down and breaking down jobs and how it would be leading us, and making sure that we understood what each and every job looked like and what the skill requirement was. And so, yes, those were the basis of all the programs. Absolutely.
Hey, Mike, how hard was it for you in terms of persuading the companies? I can understand they were feeling desperate, right? Desperation drives quite a bit. But in saying, we're going to go to a workforce that is not our typical, right? I had talked earlier in my remarks about ignored populations for some really great jobs in our industry, looking at diverse workers. And how did the executives respond to that? And were there any particular challenges? I know that you are really training everybody from every group as fast as you can.
We have a strategic imperative, because our workforce is 98% white and 85% male, to target underrepresented populations, specifically women, people of color, and veterans. That's something we decided to do, and some of the funding that we got to kick this program off is highly aligned with that outcome. Here's the thing, and this might be a little, I've said this in public a few times, so I don't mind if you repeat this, but it's kind of harsh.
Good, because we're recording.
Yeah, I know. So our industry talks a good game. So the tech industry says they want to develop talent. They say they want diversity, but their actions belie a truth that's not aligned with that. We aren't willing as an industry to change the way we recruit. We're not even willing to change where we recruit. We do some experiments on the side, and we do a bunch of stuff that looks good as corporate social responsibility, but materially speaking, no substantive change. The adoption of our tech apprenticeship is anemic in the tech industry, and it has been spectacular in the financial services industries, in life science, and also in the manufacturing industries, where they get already what workforce development is, because you don't get to be an accountant unless you first train for a while. I mean, even if you get a CPA, it doesn't mean anything. You got to do a whole bunch of grunt work to actually learn what the job is. The same thing's true in manufacturing. You start by sweeping the floor so you don't kill yourself, right? And so that's in their DNA. It's not in the tech industry's DNA. So sadly, most of the take up for tech apprenticeships have not been in tech. We're working on it.
I can't help but slip in that in our industry, I'm particularly proud that 44% of the jobs in our state directly in the life science industry are held by women. But that doesn't mean we can't do a much better job in reaching other populations. So, hey, Mitch, you're nodding and I'm wondering what you're thinking. And as you've looked at really some exemplar states, I mean, obviously I'm incredibly biased, and believe me, Washington State, at least this is my last one of these folks where I'm holding up North Carolina as the example. They're probably a little bit tired of hearing of it. What are some other exemplar states out there and cool things that you've seen done, again, where industry has leaned in to solving its workforce problems?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there really are approaches that have stood out, and there's actually one initiative, you know, because I do think a lot of North Carolina was manufacturing oriented, where, you know, unfortunately for Maryland's life sciences, manufacturing has come a lot slower, and tends to be because of Hopkins and NIH and University of Maryland, still very much in emerging companies. And so what's the skill needs there, right?
And it's similar.
Right? Yes,
Similar.
exactly.
Yeah.
Washington, right? So maybe, so there actually is a longstanding program called the Biotechnical Institute, which trains recent high school students who are not quite making it through college, who are found themselves in dead-end jobs, to be lab technicians. Now, quite frankly, not everybody can do it, right? You got to have dexterity, you got to have some of the capabilities of problem solving that Michael was discussing. But they've had a long track record now, and they're actually talking about expanding dramatically in the state. So there's no reason why we can't bring this along in the same way that Michael was describing. And I think literally, as one of the folks in the chat box suggested, outside the box thinking. I mean, we just got to get away from the idea that we need degrees, and we need to be thinking about credentials and skills, and the industry needs to lead that. And, you know, the Biotechnical Institute, yeah, it started in a core lab at Hopkins, you know, many moons ago, but it's been embraced by a lot of industry in Maryland. And so that is really the essence to make this work. And what I've seen across lots and lots of states is when the industry stands up with a united voice, it changes the way legislators and higher education addresses it. And, you know, of course, in the life sciences, you know, the challenges may be a little bit bigger because it's real expensive to run a lab tech, you know, educational experience. But if we do it smartly, we could do it in a co-location facility. We could do it with kind of more maker spaces. We could do it in ways that allows for ideation to also be part of it, and to allow what Washington State is very, very good at, and I hopefully think Maryland is very good at as well, move forward, which is we just got to grow some of our own and have them really reach significant size. And then we'll get into the manufacturing issues that North Carolina gets to play in a massive way.
Exactly. So this panel should have gone on so much longer, but I will tell you, we're hearing some of the same challenges here from other industries. We're so aligned with the healthcare sector, right? In our state, we have massive healthcare systems, and they're having some of the same shortages. It seems to me that in that out of the box thinking is, and Michael, I think we should be taking more advantage of you being local to talk some of these things through and getting people together. I do think Washington State excels when it comes to innovation. I think we're highly competitive when we're motivated. I think the people in this state can do anything. But so far, I think because we have transitioned relatively quickly from an emerging life science ecosystem, lots and lots of startups, very few public companies, only one or two companies that, you know, CGen being an exemplar there of developing here and growing over a couple of decades. That hasn't been the norm. And all of a sudden it is, and our needs are massive. And it's exciting. It's a fantastic place to be. But I just, in closing this session, cannot say enough to those of you listening and those of you who you influence we've got to get on with it. And as the trade association, we are absolutely here to work in every way with you. We're great conveners, we're great advocates, but we cannot replace you when it comes to figuring out doing the windows on the workplace. What are needed in these jobs? Who can we partner with in the state? I would certainly think we would be partnering with WTIA and Apprenti in learning, because we have those positions as well, and make things happen. So for me, I'm so sad. I won't be here to help make them happen. But again, as I said earlier today, I will certainly be cheering everything on here. I want to thank our panelists. I want to say I'm sorry that we didn't make this longer and give more of you time to really delve in. But I think this has done exactly what I had hoped it would do. So thank you for being with us this morning. I appreciate all of you. And
Thank
in
you.
In
Thank you.
closing now, I just want to say to everybody who is listening and those who may listen later to this recording, I could not have been more honored to be your leader these past 5 years. So thank you, and have a great day.
For those